University. And this semester, we've been going through a series of conversations on what it is we might anticipate as we move through this fall and into the winter and emerge in the spring, hopefully healthier and in a well-educated position to begin to implement some strategies that help move all of us forward professionally and personally. And so I am happy to introduce our speaker tonight. And she will be joined by a long-term colleague of mine, Ed Gaskin, who has done economic development work as a consultant and leader for many years, and he's now involved with the programs in Grove Hall in Boston. And his economic development work is obviously very dependent on a number of factors that are now being shaped in relation to what will happen as we come out of this COVID economy. So we're going to start tonight with Heather Streets-Salter, who is teaching a course at Northeastern this semester on pandemics and what has happened after them. And I will start by asking her, Heather, what generated your interest in this field in the first place?
Yeah, so I have been involved in the field of world history. I'm actually, I was trained as an empire and imperialism specialist, but I've been involved in the field of world history since the beginning of the 21st century, so now for a couple of decades. And in world history, pandemics are kind of a big deal. As I'll talk about in a few minutes, the pandemics have been a feature of world history since we know of in terms of the written record. And so I have charted the spread of bubonic plague in particular. I studied under a medievalist, as an empire historian, as a historian of Britain. The cholera pandemic, pandemics of the 19th century have been a big deal. Pandemic disease in India has been a major part of what I've studied. So I guess it's really through both the fields of empire and world history that I first got interested in this.
And tell me a little bit about the nature of doing research in this kind of subject. I mean, one would think that it is not the most optimistic of subjects to be taking a look at. How do you keep moving forward doing research on this? And after your presentation, I would encourage you to tell us a little bit about how you're applying some of what you're learning to contemporary activities.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's a depressing subject. There's no denying that. But what I think is interesting about studying the history of global pandemics is, and for me, what I find comforting, I guess, in going through it right now ourselves, is there was a huge amount of tragedy, but at the same time, humans are so resilient. And a lot of people didn't survive global pandemics, but those who did picked up and kept on going. And I think for us, that is for me, it's always been an important lesson in history, is just to understand human resilience and also to understand the depth of people's humanity in the past. It's easy to think of people as numbers, but when you read what it's like to go through some of this, I think it really reminds us that we are all humans and that we have often faced similar things, even though times have changed.
Well, with that said, why don't you launch into your presentation?
All right, well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you, Ed, also for agreeing to respond. I am teaching this course on the history of global pandemics right now at Northeastern, and I've taught it before. I taught it before there was a pandemic, And it was sort of in the aftermath of SARS and the H1N1 pandemic of 2009. And a lot of scientists and also world historians were saying, hey, you know, we're due for another big pandemic. And I thought it would be a good time to have students think about, you know, how we can prepare and what it was like in the past. And like I said, at the time, we were looking to what might happen in the future, hoping actually that it was a long way away. And in fact, it wasn't nearly as long as would. When the scale of this current pandemic became clear in the spring of this year, I wanted to offer the class again, but this time to students who were actually living through an actual pandemic. And what I hoped was that the course would give them historical perspective with which to view the present. So basically, we take a global perspective in the class and we look at 4 of the major pandemic diseases that have played such an important role in human history since the medieval period mostly. So bubonic plague, smallpox, cholera, and the 1918-19 influenza pandemic. And then students work over the course of the semester on projects about a different pandemic that we don't cover in class, like tuberculosis or polio or AIDS. We look at the science of disease, but we also focus on the experience. I mean, this is really where I come in as a historian, is we focus on the experience of people who lived through the pandemics and also on how the pandemics shape the future in both the short and the long terms. So I know that the focus of this open classroom this semester is on post-pandemic recovery strategies. And on that score, I have a little bit of bad news. And that is, the bad news is that really, I don't think history is a very good indicator for predicting the future. Historians are notoriously hesitant to make predictions about the future, mostly because the societal or the social, the economic, the cultural, and the political circumstances in any given time constantly change. So that makes one set of actions that might have worked in the past have no effect, or even worse, fail or have a detrimental effect in the present. So in my opinion, history does not really repeat itself, or at least that repetition is only ever partial. So also the other thing is that our ability as humans to correct our mistakes based on the lessons of the past has been truly abysmal. So that's a little bit of bad news. And so I guess spoiler alert, I don't really think that history can give us much insight to what our pandemic recovery might look like, especially in terms of specific policies, because so many different factors will help decide that. And many of those factors are things that have never existed before or have never existed in the particular combinations that they do now. So like, who's going to lead this country after November 3rd? That will change a lot of things. For the world, how long will it take to get a good vaccine? Who's going to have access to it? So there's so many different variables. But I will say that if history can't offer us specific guidelines for recovery, or at least in my opinion, it can give us perspective on what we're collectively going through. So I think it really can give us clues about things we're experiencing now are typical in other pandemics, or if they're unique to our time. It might also give us some clues about major issues to look out for, even if their specific shape is particular to their own time period. So with those caveats, I'd like to say a few things about what historical perspective can offer us as we think about our own experience in the current pandemic and what might come afterwards. So let me just start with this, which might seem obvious, but is also very, very important. And I said this a little bit when I was talking to Ted a minute ago, but epidemic disease has been a constant feature of human life since at least the Neolithic period, when people began to settle down in one place and to farm. So we don't have a lot of records for this, for this very early period, but we know that microbes had the best ability to cross species, when humans began to settle down and live in close contact with domesticated animals like geese and ducks and pigs and cows. We begin to get written records of epidemic disease in the 5th century before the Common Era. So during the Peloponnesian War, and that was regarding a disease that might have been typhoid fever. And then since then, human history has been punctuated by recorded multiple epidemics and pandemics, really over and over again. And the more densely settled and interconnected our world became, the faster and more widely a disease could spread. So some of these pandemics were absolutely catastrophic. So I just want to take Eurasia after the 14th century, sorry, as an example. And I'm going to share my screen real quick, and hopefully that is not actually what I want. There, that is what I want, Rattus Rattus. So in 1347, fleas carrying bubonic plague traveled along with this little creature, Rattus Rattus, the brown rat, on the trade routes from Central Asia to North Africa and the Levant and Europe. This horrifying bacterial infection, and I won't describe it, but believe me, it was really horrifying. It killed about 50% of everyone that it infected, with the result that between 1/3 to 75% of the populations of the regions that it encountered died. And this, by the way, is the bacterium, and the flea, which is its vector. And I'm giving you a map here to show you how far the plague actually spread in this episode of plague. So once the plague arrived in 1347, or it began in 1347, once the first wave of plague was over in 1351 or 52, depending on where you were, it didn't just go away. It continued to come back, sometimes in one place and sometimes in another, for centuries. In Europe, it didn't go away until about 1700. And then as late as the 1890s, there was a massive wave of bubonic plague that came from China through Hong Kong and went around the world, including to San Francisco, killing millions, just 10 million in India alone in the 1890s. In between 1347 and 1900, in Eurasia, there were also major waves, repeated waves of smallpox, influenza, tuberculosis, yellow fever in the Americas and sub-Saharan Africa, and cholera, among others. Even more catastrophic, and by the way, this is some of the European art that emerged as a result of that medieval plague epidemic. Then even more catastrophic were the plagues that came to the Americas with the Europeans in the 16th century. And that resulted in a demographic disaster that killed at least, over time, at least 50% of indigenous populations, with waves that continued to strike indigenous communities for centuries. So the point here is that epidemic or pandemic disease has really been the norm in human societies for millennia, occurring with devastating regularity in nearly every part of the world. Like I said before, we can take a little bit of comfort from the fact that we know that pandemics are not unique to us by any means. But on the other hand, we know from this history that this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic that we face right now, will not be the last pandemic that humanity will face. And in fact, the more densely populated we become, the more interconnected we become, and the more we interact with domesticated and wild animals, the more likely that we will face novel, lethal microbes with the power to spread quickly in the relatively near future. So that is not exactly happy news. But it is probably the most accurate thing we can say about the future from what we know about history. There's another thing to talk about as we endure the pandemic and begin to think about coming out on the other side. And that is that pandemics in the past often did not unite human communities. And in fact, you could even say that pandemics have frequently brought out the worst in humans. So historical examples show us that human communities frequently try to place the blame for pandemics on a particular group and then make them pay. And this is a slide from 14th century Strasbourg in Germany, that massacre that took place on February 14th. One of the biggest targets of community anxiety in the bubonic plague in the medieval period were Jewish communities. So in 14th century Europe, during the Black Death episode of the bubonic plague, European communities frequently targeted Jewish communities as scapegoats for the disease, where Jewish people were attacked, sometimes they were banished, and in many cases they were murdered with really depressing regularity in the historical records of Western Europe. The people being massacred in this picture had been accused of poisoning the well of of Strasbourg and then leading to the disease, because of course no one understood what the vector was. And generally under torture, somebody would confess, and then vigilante citizens would round up the Jewish community and murder them. We also see this in less murderous but still extremely hostile form in a variety of other pandemics, when people were likely to blame those they see as outsiders for bringing disease. So during the 20th people of Asian descent were targeted over and over again as vectors for pandemics that were sometimes even named for their supposed site of origin. So epidemics that come to mind immediately are the Hong Kong influenza pandemic of 1968, the SARS coronavirus in 2002 and 2003, and then of course our own COVID-19 that the President of the United States continues to call the Chinese virus. And this simply just feeds these old tropes of blaming outsiders for pandemic disease. And this was a Bay Area sign that occurred during our COVID-19 pandemic this summer. So during other pandemics, like the cholera pandemic of the mid-19th century or the tuberculosis pandemic of the 20th, poor or oppressed people in general were blamed for being transmitters of deadly disease, and their bodies became synonymous with filth and contagion. So in fact, the urban poor were and are, actually, we know that the urban poor are the most at risk to suffer from pandemic disease that spread through either close contact or contaminated water. And this is a reality that we continue to see in our current pandemic. But in a period when people didn't understand how diseases were spread, the circumstances and environments caused by poverty were overlooked in favor of blaming the spread of disease on the bodies of impoverished people themselves. So actually, the predicament of the impoverished and human communities during pandemics is another way in which pandemics really don't unite us. So even in times when it was not clear how diseases were spread, it was clear that diseases usually took their most vicious toll on the most marginalized, most impoverished in society. So in the period of the Black Death, for example, the city of Naples, which had massive slums, even in the medieval period, suffered some of the highest death rates in Europe. Smallpox also struck hardest in areas where people lived close together. Cholera, which is, you see a cartoon here about cholera in the mid-18th century. Cholera did its greatest damage in poor areas of towns and cities where the water was likely to be contaminated with fecal matter. And then tuberculosis, of course, spread readily in cramped and damp quarters common to the urban poor. So Not only that, we've seen in many pandemic episodes that the impulse to flee, to just run away, has remained something that is in our. We also saw it in the Black Death of the medieval period and many other pandemics as well. But the ability to flee was always far more open to those who had means, who might have estates in the countryside, for example, or simply the cash with which to live while they were away. This is actually a major theme of pandemics, which is the unequal effects of pandemics. And this was exacerbated in other ways as well, because efforts to rebuild after pandemics also tended to favor the wealthy. This was certainly true in England after the Black Death, because those businesses that could withstand the shutting down of almost all economic activity tended to be wealthier to begin with. And then when disease subsided, they were among the best equipped to jump wholeheartedly into rebuilding. So while there certainly was a long, long economic recovery after the Black Death in places like England, it was an unequal recovery that favored those who were already wealthy, which tended to concentrate wealth in the hands of even fewer people. And I think this is something that we need to keep an eye on for this pandemic as well. So we also have to think about what effect this pandemic will have on the global balance of power. We've seen in the past how some places become so economically ruined from pandemics that they never recover, or that they recover only slowly while other places take off. So I think that's one thing that we can learn from history in terms of thinking about what will happen to the global balance of power after this pandemic. Ted, how am I doing? Should I stop? Should I keep going? I have a few more points.
Please keep going.
All right, so there's just a few other things that I think that past pandemics can give us a perspective on for our own period. And one is that very real tension between the tendency of states and communities to take draconian measures to combat epidemic disease and the desire to preserve individual liberties. Even though in the medieval period, people might not have talked about it in terms of liberty necessarily, but we can look at it that way. And again, the plague gives us a place to start, because in desperate attempts to stop the spread of a disease they didn't understand, cities across Europe began instituting quarantines, sometimes locking whole families inside of their house so that no one could exit, meaning that the families could not get needed supplies or anything else for that matter. Another thing that happened during the plague pandemics was that cities developed committees that forcibly inspected houses for plague victims. And then when they found them, they forcibly took those people to plague hospitals, where they often died alone without community rituals. So the effect of these draconian measures were frequently counterproductive, because families often tried to hide infected loved ones, or they chose to flee their homes to escape such measures and thereby prevent or spread the disease to other places. And if you think that that was mostly a medieval thing, nope. We see similar reactions in India during the third major plague outbreak that began in the 1890s and didn't end until 1921. So at the start of the outbreak, mitigation efforts by the British colonizers in India were so draconian. Again, forced entry and inspection, forced removal of infected individuals, refusal to allow death rituals, seizure of property, burning down entire neighborhoods that they thought were infected. And these measures were so draconian that it spurred massive flight from the cities, thereby spreading plague to other areas of the colony as people moved. So, and then such methods also spurred massive resistance in India, so massive that the British had to abandon them or face armed revolt. So epidemics of cholera and yellow fever and influenza, among others, have all led local or state governments to enforce quarantines, sequester and isolate infected individuals, border closures, and we've seen all of this in our own pandemic as well. We saw the massive and unprecedented enforcement of a cordon sanitaire that cut off the city of Wuhan and its surroundings from the rest of the world as the Chinese government tried to stop the spread of COVID-19 earlier this year. States around the world, we saw, restricted entry and exit, prohibited large gatherings, enforced quarantines, and tracked the movement of people. So while our own time is very different from the medieval period or the 19th century or even the early 20th century, as we move toward recovery, I think it's worth remembering that historically, pandemics have often led to a renewed concentration of state power, in part because of the institution of these dramatic anti-pandemic measures. And this actually might be one of the more charitable ways that we can see another tension between liberties on the one hand and state power on the other, and that is resistance to vaccination and resistance to wearing masks. I won't really actually go into the whole resistance to vaccination, but I can if you have questions about it. But in fact, resistance to vaccination is not just a 20th and 21st century thing. This actually, since inoculation was introduced to the West, it was a topic of heated controversy. And in fact, in Boston, in a smallpox episode in 1721, Cotton Mather, whose name you might recognize, he was a big proponent of inoculation for smallpox. It stirred up such heated controversy that somebody threw a bomb through his window in response to his efforts to inoculate settlers. And the note said, "Cotton Mather, you dog, damn you. I'll inoculate you with this, with a pox to you." So this is not new. This whole thing about being worried that the cure will be worse than the disease. So I think it's reasonable to expect, as we move toward recovery, that portions of the world's population will resist being vaccinated on the grounds of individual liberty, or at least on the grounds of suspicion about state designs. And then finally, the use of masks is another battleground over individual liberties that is not new. This is something that we saw for sure in the 1918-19 pandemic. And I know that we've all seen images lately of Americans in 1918 attending baseball games and going about everyday life all masked up, sort of making us feel like that's a familiar kind of feeling. But it was not all about compliance during the Great Influenza. City after city enacted legislation to enforce mask wearing. And as they did that, resistance to the legislation grew as well. So just for example, on November 9th, 1918, more than 1,000 people in San Francisco were brought to jail for not wearing masks. Detractors around the country continued to impose mask wearing throughout that pandemic, saying that the whole idea was bunk, that it was dirty, that it was ineffective. And in 1919, San Franciscans and also people in other cities as well even formed anti-mask leagues. So while I know that a lot has been said about the ignorance of people who refuse to wear masks, and I agree that it is not medically advisable not to wear masks, it is often tied to this long history of fear, overreach, fears that have a lot of legs in this country that many people believe is all about personal liberties. So as we move toward recovery, we here in this country in particular, we need to contend with this prominent set of beliefs in order to come up with a workable balance between public health and the preservation of individual rights. And then the very last thing that I'll say is that states don't respond well to pandemics. This is pretty much true across the board, especially at first. In addition to chaos and resorting to draconian measures, especially that characterize the period from the medieval period until the 20th century, we see repeated examples of states allowing pandemics to spread out of control because either they refuse to acknowledge them, because like in 1918, there was a war on and the president, Woodrow Wilson, had better things to do than to think about 675,000 Americans dying, or because of fears of disrupting economies, which is what we saw with the Chinese refusal to acknowledge the SARS virus in 2002, at least at first. We can see that the consequences of poor leadership in pandemics can be extremely severe. And just by the way, this isn't the first time that a pandemic has reached into the White House. During the 1918-19 pandemic, the influenza reached into Woodrow Wilson's White House, and Woodrow Wilson himself caught the flu in 1919 when he was in Paris for the peace talks for the war. And many people close to him argued that his experience with the flu changed him forever, acting like it did some sort of neurological damage. So I hope that some of these things will help bring some perspective to how pandemics have impacted the world prior to this. There's so much more to say, but that's just some of the highlights. But also to highlight some of the things that we might face as we move toward recovery. And not all of it is bad news. A lot of what I just said is depressing, but I think the one thing that we need to take comfort in is that we do have choices. We are not bound by history. We know that history happened and we can talk about what did happen, but we can make choices ourselves that do not echo the past, and we can make rational decisions based on what we see now rather than what happened in the past.
Let me remind our participants that this session is being recorded and will be archived. And while the session is going forward, we encourage folks to enter any questions that you may have into our Q&A box. We will do our very best to answer all of the questions that come in. So at the bottom of the screen, there is a box into which you can post your questions, and we will address all of those. I have a question about what your findings have uncovered around some of the medical practices that may or may not have been put in place to address the pandemic issues. Pandemics start as a medical issue, and yet you have described in some very interesting detail what many of the social effects have been, and what some of the devastating effects have been on large populations, devastation of much of the native population in the Americas. What are the kinds of medical practices that may have been put in place, and what wasn't done that you may have encountered through your research?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, it's really somewhat tragic because, of course, people didn't understand the world of microbes until the 20th century. And so people had no idea what was, in fact, with the plague, it wasn't known until 1908 that was fleas on rats that were spreading it. So every medical intervention either didn't work at all, was incredibly detrimental, or worked by accident. And so, in fact, quarantine could work. That was actually a medical, a way to keep people from getting, from contracting the plague. So that actually, they didn't know that it would work, but they thought that people were contagious, that they were getting it from other people. So that was one thing. But there are so many things, Ted, that people did, like for the old practice of bleeding someone, because medical theories thought in terms of the humors, the blood and the bile. A lot of times it was prescribed to bleed someone if they had something wrong with them. So this happened with smallpox, which was a hideous, horrible disease. And in fact, this is one case in which, with smallpox, where wealthier people always survive better, because wealthier people tended to have doctors, and the prescriptions for smallpox were so awful in terms of both bleeding and putting on like mercury paste onto the sores and stuff like that. I mean, just in general, the medical practices until the 20th century were not particularly helpful, and sometimes actually encouraged mortality.
A question has come in as to whether in your research you've ever encountered any of these pandemics or epidemics that led to policy changes that might have addressed questions of the inequalities that the pandemics tended to expose around wealth and poverty. Did any of these medical events in your research lead to positive changes that addressed issues of inequality?
Indirectly, yes. So I guess the one thing that you can say, especially with 19th century pandemics, is that public health became a thing, because it wasn't before. So if you lived in an urban area, you had horse manure, you had human waste in the streets, and during the 19th century, in order to stop some of the pandemics, because actually John Snow theorized, didn't quite understand why, but theorized that it was contaminated water that was making people sick. Cities did try to clean up by making sure that waste went to the right place, that it was that people didn't spit in the streets, for example, because that was also a big thing. I wouldn't say, though, that it was for the benefit of the poor. It did benefit the poor indirectly, but the concern was always for the wealthier members of society. So indirectly, it did help.
Well, let's use that example as a bridge to the work of Ed Gaskin, who is our other guest this evening. Ed has been involved with consulting and economic development for many years. And fortunately for the community and for us, he's now working in the Grove Hall section of Boston, where there has been endemic poverty, and where residents and businesses have for a long time felt the brunt, really, the downside of the American economy and the inequalities that we've seen across Boston in terms of commercial and real estate development, where people live, redlining, and educational inequalities. So I'm going to ask Ed to talk a little bit about the work that he's been doing, particularly as it relates to, Heather, your last comments about improving the quality of the local environment, through which a disease spreads much more easily in poor neighborhoods than in wealthy neighborhoods. Ed's been working on developing an eco district in Grove Hall. Ed, why don't you start with a few comments about the kind of work you've been doing prior to now, and then tell us a bit about the work you're doing in Grove Hall now, and how that work may be impacted by what we're seeing in many of the gross disparities that have been revealed in the current pandemic. Ed?
Well, thank you, Professor. And to my esteemed colleague, that was a great talk. I didn't know that about the history of pandemics in the past, and I thought you did a great job of making some of those points relevant. So I'm going to try to do some slides. I don't know if I'm going to be able to be successful at this, but I'm going to try. I guess I have to find the presentation first. Maybe somebody can help me navigate it. I had it here a second ago on my screen. Let's see here. Maybe this is it. And all right, so here we go. So as you've just pointed out, I just want to give our participants some background. So I'm the executive director of the Greater Grove Hall Main Streets, and that's a small neighborhood, depending on how you want to measure it, from anywhere between 18 and 40,000 people. It's about 1.8 square miles, and as you see from this chart from a demographic standpoint, it's about 60% Black, 30% Hispanic. As you can see that 40-something% of the people speak a language other than English at home. And again, I'm just warning you guys, I'm going fast. You guys are young, agile minds, so this is good. But this area has, it says like 97.5% of the people, there's more single parents here than basically almost anywhere else that you can find in the country. And as the professor pointed out, 30% of this people here are at or below the poverty level. You've got about 5% of the, about 1 in 5, about 20% of the people have a high school degree, about 10% have a college degree. And here shows where all the brown fields are in the city of Boston, and unfortunately they happen to be in Grove Hall. So even though we only have about 3% of the geographic area, we have 40% of the brown fields. And we also have the major exposure to brown paint. So that's kind of the, or lead paint. So that's kind of like the background. So
Ed, let me,
yes.
For just a second to say, not everyone may be seeing your slides at this moment.
Oh, okay.
So we want to make sure that to the extent possible, folks see the graphics that you can see at this moment.
Okay. So do you want me to describe them then?
Yeah, I think that would be helpful.
Okay.
And slow down just a little bit, given that we may not be able to see the graphics that accompany what you're saying.
All right, thank you, sir. I appreciate that. So the first thing that happened when we had when the pandemic struck, and from the city and the state level, there was a state of emergency and the businesses closed down or starting to close down. It's like the travel and tourism, which is a big part in the city, and airlines and hotels were feeling the economic impact. We didn't feel the economic impact in Grove Hall because there's not many tourists coming there. When the colleges and universities basically said they were going to go online, and some of the students went home, that didn't affect us either, because unlike neighborhoods like Brighton and Alston, we don't have a lot of college students hanging out in Grove Hall. And the same thing with the sports and entertainment. So when you saw the various sport teams, whether it was the Celtics or the Patriots or the Bruins, all that stopping, or the entertainment, like at movie theaters or in the theater district, again, nothing like that had any impact. Same thing with the construction. A lot of people, I think there's something like 22 different major construction projects in the city of Boston. Again, no impact. Same thing with the bars and restaurants. There's only at best 2 bars in the area, maybe 1 full service restaurant. And the same thing with the financial services area, which is about 1/3 of the nation's financial services is downtown, and professional services, all your big law firms, consulting firms, things like that. Almost everything was shutting down in the city of Boston, and it had almost no impact in the Grove Hall area. So if you were driving down Blue Hill Avenue, you could see the barbershops, beauty salons, nail salons, bodegas, liquor stores, all the other nonprofits, city agencies, literally like nothing was closed. And what that became was a very visual understanding of how disconnected or segregated Boston's Black and Brown community was from the rest of the community. Right now, for instance, you'll hear, as the president will say quite frequently, about how well the stock market is doing. And so you had these basically very pro-business policy. So with all the deregulation, that helped businesses. The first cut of the first tax cuts were about $1.5 trillion. That's trillion. And then part of what was driving the stock market was what are called the FANG stocks, basically Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google. So if you can imagine, people were spending more time on their computers like Facebook, people were ordering stuff because they didn't want to go out like Amazon, people were watching more movies like Netflix. And so those businesses were, not only did they do well, they were doing extremely well as the pandemic was striking. And it shows you they were like up just between March and June, they were up like 62%. And so they were driving the rest of the economy up. And again, it's almost like it was a separate world. Like here's Grove Hall and here's the rest of the world, and never the two shall meet. And so you see, if you could see, I have a chart in front of you that shows that what I just mentioned is the FANG stocks sort of skyrocketing over time. And then you see the rest of the stock market, and you just to point out, about 50% of the people in the United States have no stock bond investments whatsoever. So they weren't participating in what was happening in the rising economy.
And let me ask again.
Yes.
Try sharing your screen, which may make the slides more visible.
Okay, I thought it, but I'll redo it. How's that? Let me try one more time here. Sorry, I got to find it. I apologize. Okay, let's see if I can figure out how to do the share again. If I can solve the next one, I'm almost there. What am I doing wrong?
Is there a share screen button at the bottom of your screen?
Yes, but for some reason I'm not seeing it. So I don't know what it is that I am or am not doing, but I'm gonna get it there. I'm gonna get there. All right, so maybe I'm getting closer. Do you see anything at all? Okay.
We see you.
Okay,
well,
that's
there we go.
All right, well now we've got, I apologize for not getting that right the first time. Okay, so what I was just talking about was how well the what were called the FANG stocks, the technology stocks, were doing. And so just as an example, between March and June, the wealthiest people in the country, they're like here, it says Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Warren Buffett, and Larry Ellison saw their net worth go up by $100 billion in just those few months. So just those 5 people, with what as a result of the pandemic, that's the positive impact it had on them. And I say $7 trillion is real money. And the reference here is that when the President's Council of Economic Advisor, Dr. Kevin Hassett, he basically said that they had thrown $6 trillion of stimulus into the economy to basically try to keep the Wall Street businesses going well. Now, part of that you might remember was coming out in the stimulus package. So when I talk about that, it's real money. If you gave basically every African American in the United States $150,000, that would have only come to $1.4 trillion. And if you would have paid off all the student loan debt, that was only $1.6 trillion. And certainly $7 trillion would have made a nice down payment on whether it's the Green New Deal or the single payment healthcare or shore up the Medicaid, Medicare system. So that was a lot of money. And so when people are always mystified as to why the stock market keeps going at record heights, even though from all the other indicators, it looks like we're in a depression, that's why is that you have these two sort of bifurcated things happening. So part of what was happening, if you remember, there was the PPP loan program that the SBA had gotten, but most of this, on the first round, almost none of the small businesses received any money. If you remember, people like Steak Shack, which had $100 million in cash, had received a $10 million grant from the government. And clearly people said, well, that wasn't the way the program was designed. But the problem is that sort of from a systematic perspective, it wasn't going to help the people in Grove Hall. So for example, the unbanked, there's more businesses who are unbanked than there are individuals, because at least individuals might have a checking account or a credit card or a savings account, as opposed to a business that has a business relationship. The same thing with customer service. The large banks would be calling their best customers to let them know about this deal. A small business, let's say like in Grove Hall, isn't gonna get that. And the same thing with the prioritization. It takes just as much work to do the big loans as it does to do the little ones. And the bank makes the money on processing fees. It doesn't make the money on the lending. So it has no incentive to actually to make these small loans available to the smaller businesses. Same thing with outreach, same thing with risk. You would think that obviously a smaller business that really, really needs the money to hang on is far more risky than obviously a larger business that doesn't need the money. Language was an issue. The program was only put out in English at first. Eventually they got it into Spanish and they caught up with some of the other ones. And the same thing with the technical assistance. The technical assistance as to what you needed to do to actually apply for the loan and get through the process at first was only available in English. Lots of misinformation. The largest banks, so it wasn't even all the banks were even equal. So the largest banks had literally 1 million applications and $100 billion of loans ready to go as soon as the window opened at 10:30 in the morning that morning. And other little things like if you are a bank and you're trying to read an application, all things being equal, and you read that there's a hair salon on Newberry Street and there's a hair salon in Grove Hall, the sense is that the one on Newberry Street is less risky. Whether that's true or not, that's just the impression. And so even in the best of times, the SBA only lends about 3% of the money to Black-owned businesses. So one of the things that happened that was sort of fell from the sky is that one of my colleagues called up one day and said, we all need to get together and make something happen because we could see the unfairness of the system. And so basically about 40 nonprofit organizations, 5 banks said, let's see what we can do to actually get these loans or these grants to the people that need them. And then what you see there were some of the statistics. And here was an example of the 40 organizations that came together all on a volunteer basis to do something. Another aspect of the COVID-19 was the digital divide in small businesses. So as you notice, a lot of people have been doing online ordering, touchless ordering, curbside and takeout delivery, but in a place like Grove Hall, the vast majority of the businesses don't even have a website. They don't use email. And so as the consumer behavior was shifting, basically they were going to be locked out of any of those kind of consumer preferences in terms of how people wanted to buy. And even if you had a restaurant that didn't have its own website, but was using a thing like Grubhub or Uber Eats, the problem is that they took 30% of the profit and they only paid the businesses once a week. So suddenly, where they were used to maybe receiving cash or getting a credit card payment, they would go to the bank each day. They now basically had to shell out for a week at a time before they received any money back. And so things like this were just like crippling the businesses in my neighborhoods. There were large businesses, banks, big companies that all wanted to chime in and help these small businesses. But part of the problem again was the applications were only in English. They did on a first come, first served basis. So if you were waiting for it to be translated to another language, it was very possible that the money was gone. They would email out the stuff, or you'd have to go to a website, but the website would only be in English. Again, most of my businesses didn't have email. So like one time I was actually literally trying to pass out, if you can imagine, $1,000 bills to the businesses as part of the grant program, but all the businesses were closed because of COVID, and because they didn't use email, I had no way to get information to them. The city of Boston had a program where they gave out $7.5 million, and they take great pride in that. But they said that there's 40,000 small businesses in the city of Boston, and they got about 2,600 applications. So if you think about one of the worst economic times, because people think we're in a depression, that basically 90% of the people didn't even apply for free cash. And so for me, that was more of a reflection of the poor outreach job that happened. So obviously what everybody's asking about, even like if you think of the Biden campaign about Build Back Better and where do we go from here and how do we move forward, one of the things that we had to ask ourselves, well, what was actually tried in the past? And so, you know, if you remember people like Chuck Turner and other community organizers trying to get or Bernie Sanders, you know, getting a higher minimum wage, living wage, prevailing wage, Boston jobs for Boston residents. But historically, things like that haven't really worked. And the unions are still just as segregated today as they were at any time in the past. The people that tried to do more procurement, if you remember, the city of Boston only does about 1% of its business, of its $640 million, with people of color and women. And I said in the diversity, equity, and inclusion sphere, it seems the only people that are hired are the diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants and CXOs. People said, well, what about the strategy of buying Black and self-efficacy? And again, I thought it was ironic that people said the buy Black strategy was racist, because if white people only bought from white people, we would say that was racist. So how could we legitimately say that Black people should buy from Black people only? And then this issue on entrepreneurship, social impact investing, and you've seen what a challenge all these different kinds of things have been. So part of what we thought was some of the solutions for going forward is we thought about co-ops. And one of the examples is we use the Mondragon example in Mondragon, Spain, because what you noticed is that, let's say like with the flight attendants, there's like the Flight Attendants Association and the airlines as an industry. And as an industry, they were able to go to the government and say, we need $50 billion. But I didn't have the same type of thing, right? So all of my barbers who might be doing a 1099 or beauticians or nail stylists, whatever, they had no real collective power to actually go to anybody and say, as an industry, we need to be bailed out. So you'd watch, whether it was the airline industry or the restaurant industry or whatever, all my independent contractors and small businesses really had no collective power. And one of the ways that they might be able to be more successful is if they were able to form some co-ops and leverage their numbers. We focused on, again, to go forward, focusing on Black-founded technology companies. And it may or may not be a common knowledge to people, but less than 1% of all tech companies have a Black founder. So I think there's maybe 227 Black tech founded companies in the United States out of like 9,000. And so here just shows some of the statistics. And so the question becomes, look, we haven't been able to make some of the progress in the past, getting in the union, getting procurement dollars, etc. What about the jobs of the future? And it doesn't look like the jobs of the future at this present status are any more promising than the ones of the past. But it does look like something that we would like to try to bank on. If you look in Boston, for instance, which you think is a high-tech mecca and known for innovation, rivaling Silicon Valley, certainly and with people coming out of Harvard and MIT and all the other business schools, Babson, Northeastern, whatever, certainly we should have more Black founders, but we really don't. And what happens is when you start to look at the ecosystem in the different cities across the country, you begin to see why. Here's just an example of some of the actual Black tech conferences in other cities. And the only one that Boston had is the one that I put together, which is like a fraction of something like this. You know, we talked about the importance, and again, I'm just going to skip through these. I don't have to go through everything, but why would we want to focus on Black technology? You know, one of the things is just making the world a better place. We had a guy that came to one of our events. It was this Black guy, MIT, PhD, and what he had invented was taking abandoned oil wells and converting those into geothermal power units. So he was actually making clean energy. So you think about the world's problems in terms of climate change, and you need like everybody, all the smart people, all hands on deck. And he had told us that until he came to our event, that he had never been asked to present anywhere. I just find that amazing. And then after that, he came and met a venture capitalist. And the last time I was reading about him, he was in Forbes magazine because of the technology. But again, part of the reason why we're trying to focus on the using technology as a potential strategy going forward, and why we held these events, were for some of these reasons. You know, there's some problems. So like this one company, Black Girls Nutrition, is probably not likely to be started by a white man. The wealth creation that comes from starting a business or being an early founder and having equity in these kind of businesses, helping the country become more competitive. But the other one was the role models. When we invited schools in and made it much more family friendly, they could walk into a venue and every company founder of a tech company was a person that looked like them. And so suddenly when somebody's trying to say, why am I studying STEM? Why am I trying to take calculus and things like that? I'm never going to use that. And then suddenly you meet a room full of people and they show you, well, you can do your own thing. You can start your own business. And so anyway, the idea is that there's lots of benefits to that. The other thing that we're trying to focus on was advanced manufacturing. Ironically enough, the state has made lots of investments in this statewide, except there's no advanced manufacturing program in Boston or Brockton. And so it's a career pathway that allows people to get to the middle class, maybe making between $70,000 and $100,000 a year without having to get a post-secondary degree. Which those are the kind of things that make sense. Using this slide, when Mayor Walsh was in Brooklyn, New York, he actually came across a company called MakerBot. MakerBot was based on technology that came out of MIT. It was providing 300 jobs in Brooklyn, and 47% of the people who were working there had an associate's degree or less. And so the Mayor Walsh said, why weren't those Boston jobs? I could have used those jobs like in places like Roxbury or Dorchester. And the issue is because we have no infrastructure, nor has anybody made a commitment to say, you know what, this is the kind of thing of the future. Let's put a stake in the ground and let's make this happen. Another thing that we were trying to do, and perhaps there's a professor out there someplace that's interested in this, is we said, why don't we just open the whole thing up and just get ideas from everybody in terms of economic development. Just like we do crowdsource money and crowdsource ideas, why don't we just crowdsource economic development ideas? So that was, again, I just mentioned that. And that was the whole point. We would love to do a new health center, and I'm just going to stop there. Obviously, with all the disease and disparity in health outcomes, as basically being discussed all the time, clearly we would have a direct impact from the health center. We would be able to deal with the health disparities, and we would be able to bring more housing to the area. So, without going through any more, that was my mad dash rush to get through, and I'm ready for you.
Well, thanks, Ed. And it appears that you should plug in your computer so that we don't lose you.
Well, yeah, I got it.
Okay, in the balance of this conversation. I'm very curious. Both of you have pointed out the kinds of disparities that have existed around race and class coming out of prior pandemics and today. I'm curious as to whether any of the research that you've done has uncovered concerted efforts on the part of health professionals or housing professionals or economic development professionals to mobilize programs, mobilize initiatives that would lead to focused and concerted activities to overcome those disparities which have been so clearly highlighted by what we see not only in this particular pandemic, but in the past. Was this something that emerged from 1919, for example, that could have begun to jumpstart the economy, the post-war economy? Was there something that was initiated other than an era of discovery that came out of the plagues centuries ago? Has anyone been in a position to, in effect, take advantage of the tragedy in a way that would then focus on reducing disparities? And I also remind folks that we welcome your questions. You can type them into the Q&A box or into the chat box, and we will get to those questions. Heather, have you encountered anything over 500 odd years of pandemics that suggested that there was a concerted activity to either address health issues or design issues or the way we deal with sanitation in our cities, or that would generate employment and create some kind of economic recovery?
So I think that the efforts toward better sanitation definitely did occur, not always in the context of pandemics, but also in the context of industrialization. But as I said before, not really, the first motivation was not necessarily the health of the most vulnerable populations. I think, honestly, I feel like now is our chance, because the priorities of different societies, this is true in many, many different parts of the world, the priorities was not to make a more equal society. People tended to believe that some people needed to be at the bottom and some people needed to be at the top. I think in that way, we are perhaps, at least some of us are different in the late 20th and 21st centuries. I really feel like that is our task, because any historian and also the scientists who study pandemics will say that unless we do a better job making, reducing some of those just massive inequalities, some of the things that Ed was talking about, just even in our own city, though we are not going to, we are always going to have disasters that affect the most vulnerable in our societies the most. So unfortunately, I wish I could say, yeah, there's lots of, but not that are coming to mind.
Not even regionally, for example, in other parts of the world.
For the purpose of sanitation, yes, that benefits everyone, I guess, in the end, but not for the specific purpose of helping the most vulnerable.
I guess it's ironic that many historians have pointed to wars as a way of improving healthcare, emergency care, and a number of other health-related indices in ways that have then percolated out into a wider society to the benefit of a much wider group of people. But what I'm hearing you say is that pandemics come, they kill a lot of people, they run their course. People complain or pray or talk about how the world should be better. And then at the end of the course of that pandemic, things don't seem to change very much. What about what may have happened after polio, or what happened after the depth of the AIDS crisis? Were there social improvements that began to appear as a result of the implementation of focused, concerted policies?
Well, perhaps the vaccination campaigns might be something that you could point to, which were meant to eliminate or reduce disease in all populations in a society. So that is perhaps one thing. I mean, I think it's difficult before the middle of the 20th century because we don't have vaccines. Well, we don't have many vaccines before then, and I mean, in 1918, they produced a vaccine because they thought that what was wrong was a bacteria. So they were completely wrong. So I think that because we understand the world of microbes now, we have a better shot at doing some things that truly do mitigate. And maybe it's a little too soon for me. I'm a historian, so I like things to be kind of further in the past. But if we look at what happened after SARS, some governments did pay attention. South Korea, for example. You know, there were places that paid attention to say, you know what, we need to be ready for this kind of thing. We need to make sure that it doesn't, I mean, I don't know that it's to protect the most vulnerable necessarily, but those strategies did help to protect more South Koreans. They're in a much better spot than we are. The transnational organizations that were designed to detect pandemics, those were all policies that would benefit us all, and institutions that the United States in recent months, years has actually pulled out of. So, you know, maybe we will look back on the first part of the 21st century and say some of these efforts were actually doing some good.
You know, a lot of the impacts have been economic, and one of the questions that has come in, which I will read verbatim, raises the issue of the extent to which economic policies may have to flow from the kinds of gross disparities that we're seeing. It seems to this questioner that this pandemic is mirroring the slowness of the US government response to the Great Depression. While there was one tranche of financial support early in this calendar year, the absence of bipartisan political will to undertake important economic programs to bridge the pandemic timeframe likely will extend out the financial damage that the pandemic has exacted on the economy. Do either of you see the absence of political measures to counteract the economic impact of the pandemic to be similar to that of something as significant as the Great Depression?
You want to take a stab at that, Ed?
I was going to say, maybe we can do half and half. So I can't speak to the historical perspective from the Depression, but what I would say is I just think that there was a lack of creativity or imagination or insight as to what we should do. So what would happen is, I don't know how many millions of dollars, even in the private sector, that would come out, and you would say X company, you name it, was now going to make $10 million or $5 million available for entrepreneurs. And usually they were going to give it out $1,000 at a time or $2,500 at a time. And I don't know that that was going to do any more than just prolong the eventual outcomes. They're going to shut their doors and go under. And that's what you would see over and over and over again. And I remember recently in a discussion with the governor. People were saying, "Hey, you have emergency powers now. You can change procurement. You don't have to go through the contract bidding process. Why don't you use those emergency powers to direct some money to some minority firms?" And he basically said, "I can't because I gave all that money to the cities and towns. In other words, the federal government gave me $1 billion and I dispersed $900 million across the state." And so you see all this. When I said, $6-7 trillion, you're talking about real money. But I don't see anybody doing anything that is going to have a real meaningful, lasting impact besides something that's on the short term. And so I think that's unfortunate. So that's part of the reason why we were trying to think about what are the kinds of things, even if we get a small money, that we could get a foothold or seed to do some things differently. Therefore, help more Blacks found technology companies, the advancement in the factoring, those kind of things that I talked about in my presentation. Can we get more co-ops started, etc. Because it still isn't obvious to me that what they're doing is going to change the eventual outcome, that the wealth gap will continue to increase, that people who had little money will have little money, zero money, or negative money by the time this is all over. And that's why I was so interested in the professor's presentation, because I said, oh my God, it's like history's repeating itself in that way. Again, because structurally, it was never really designed to make it better. And that's kind of what I was trying to say with all the PPP money that the SBA put out, that it was never designed to actually help the small businesses that needed $6,000 to get by for a few more months.
Heather?
Yeah, I mean, and I think really going off of what Ed said is that when you see improvements, and historically and now, it isn't necessarily to benefit the people who really need it the most. It may be incidental, but that hasn't been the rationale behind it. And in answer to Polly's question about comparing it to the Depression, I mean, I feel like it's too soon to tell. I am a historian. I don't tell the future, but I feel that we are on track to being recorded as making the most colossal mistakes in this pandemic, in terms of the refusal to take it seriously, first of all, the refusal to do the kinds of things that Ed was saying, like to really get to the people who need it the most. I think what we're looking at right now is a recovery that is going to widen the income gap more than it even is now, which is already staggering. And so, this I think that's the track that we're on, and I think it's tragic, actually, because it doesn't have to be that way.
A question that has come in is whether there's any historical evidence that indicates whether more authoritarian or democratic governments are better able to deal with pandemics in their countries.
It's a great question, and my students, I had them debate this because it's not as easy of an answer as you might think. But it is pretty clear that what happened in China as a result of the pandemic would not have been practicable here. You couldn't have done it. Legally, it wouldn't have been possible. And so if you have a command economy and an authoritarian government, you might be more likely to impose your will. And we'll see whether or not it's effective. I think that the only thing, well, one of the things that you have to keep in mind then is, what's the cost? Because we know in China, I had a few students say like, well, Chinese people are just more willing to go along with the flow. And I'm like, oh, no. There was a lot of resistance, and there were a lot of people who needed care, for example, and weren't allowed to get it. It is not comfortable for anybody to go through what happened in China. Is there a middle way? Are there other ways? In Switzerland, which, by the way, I mean, I know I'm using Switzerland as an example. It's not a very good comparison because it's a tiny country and it's very homogenous. But I have several co-op students who are there right now, and the government suggested that people stay home and quarantine, and they tracked with their cell phones, and people did it for the most part. And so it's an example of, you don't have to be authoritarian to impose this kind of thing, but I guess it depends on where you are. I feel it's, again, this balance between public health and preserving liberty, because I think most places don't want to end up on the other side with an authoritarian government. So it may be easier for authoritarian governments to impose their will in the short run, but I think it comes at a pretty high cost.
Later this evening, there will be the one and only vice presidential debate of two candidates, either of whom might at some point end up becoming president. What is it that both of you would like to see those candidates propose as a way of transitioning beyond where we are at this moment in a post-pandemic state to something that really creates a stronger American economy and a stronger society that not only acknowledges the disparities that the pandemic has exposed, but also perhaps proposes some alternatives and some solutions for healing and for bringing people together. What would you hope to hear this evening?
Go ahead, Ed.
Oh, I was hoping you're going to answer first so I could have some more time to think about that. I don't know. I don't usually have the opportunity to think on the national level because I'm trying to think of my little residence in Grove Hall. But I think the issue is that we don't just have the pandemic, which is happening, but we also have, as you can imagine, the issues around race and racism, as we have the Black Lives Matter, which some people think is as another pandemic for which there is no vaccine, nor will there be one in the short term. And so potentially the issues that we're trying to talk about are all structural. So when I see somebody that has a Black Lives Matter sign in their front yard, which is good, but I don't understand how to connect the dots between that and making the structural changes that are necessary either to make lives better for people of color, to deal with the wealth disparity, or any of the other major issues that we have. So in the same way that we have a Green New Deal, whether you buy into it or don't buy into it, is there the equivalent that says, you know what, we're going to focus on some kind of reducing the wealth disparity as a major thrust of our campaign? Because obviously, if such a small number of people at the top control most of the wealth, it's not just an issue of taxation policy. It's a structural problem that's much larger than that. So I guess I would love to see them I'd love to see somebody who said that's an issue that we would like to address.
Heather?
Yeah, and I think I know which candidate it's most likely to come from. I guess I'd like to see something really geared toward the structural problems that Ed was talking about as well. I mean, Ed, when you said that 7 trillion is real money and this, 1 point something billion could have bought this, I'd actually like to see something like that, a real put your money where your mouth is kind of thing. Maybe even going back to the quite controversial proposal for reparations that the United States has never engaged with in any sustained kind of way. I think that that would be quite a hot button subject, but I just, without addressing these deep structural things, it's hard to see a way forward that really helps the people at the bottom.
Well, so tonight we have dealt with historical issues and context. We've looked at some of the economic issues that we need to think about as we transition into 2021. Next week, we're going to be looking at many of the health issues as we hear from Tim Hoff and from health center directors about some of the health challenges that they have seen and hope to see solutions for as we move forward. The week after that, we'll be dealing with some of the constitutional issues in a week where there could be a vote that has taken place on a new Supreme Court justice nominee. And then we have the election, and we'll be back with programming that's appropriate for folks who may have spent a long night watching election returns in the hope of seeing some kind of solution. So these next few weeks, as we lead up to and reach the national election, we'll continue to deal with specific issues around recovery and how we can move forward. And I hope to see many of you there, and thank you all for joining us tonight. To Ed and Heather, thank you very much for your presentations. I hope you have a safe evening, and I certainly hope that everyone will watch tonight's debate with an open mind and a sense of what it is we need for the future as we move forward. Thank you very much, and good night.